Hello, biology students. We're ready now to move on with our topic on evolution. And so today we're going to look a little bit closer at Darwin's theory of natural selection. And so we're going to go using a model animal, which in this case is his famous finches. And so we'll be talking about that today. All right. Remember that over this 5-year period of time, Darwin was able to study both plant and animal life on the Galapagos Islands. And so what he did was he focused his studies in on the finch bird. And so we have some pictures directly from the Origin of Species that he drew over here. And so the finches helped to inspire Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection. I do want to point out, notice that these are all the same species of bird. These are finches, and so they are the same species. And so we have evidence to back this up. So this is the science part of evolution. Many different types of finches lived along the different islands. And so even though they shared a lot of the same common characteristics, they also had some differing characteristics. And so the main differing characteristics, if you can see here, you'll see that it is within the finch's beak size and shape. And so this is going to be a very important part for Darwin to focus on to help back up his claim on natural selection. And so we'll talk about that then today. I want to show you guys a family tree of the finches. And so at the very bottom here, we have the common ancestor of all the Galapagos Island finches. It came from the South American mainland. And so birds are able to fly, obviously. It was able to fly to these different islands. And so it ended up branching off into a couple other types of finches. We have ground finches, we have tree finches, and we have warbler finches. And so as you can tell from the names, the ground finches, their environment was on the ground. The tree finches were obviously up in the trees. And so from here, we can say, for example, the ground finches differ from each other based upon their dietary needs. So we had some that were seed eaters and some that were cactus flower eaters, but yet they were all still on the ground. And so those obviously would be things that could also grow on the ground. We have in the tree finches, we have a bud eater, so bud is a part of the plant, and the insect eaters. And so notice, if you look on the right or left side here, notice that the beaks for these finches tend to be longer, or wider and shorter, whereas the ones over here, the ones that are bud eaters or insect eaters, tend to have smaller, more narrower beaks. And so the big idea here is that depending upon the food source, it's going to change the shape and the size of the finch's beaks in order for it to better adapt to its environment. And so it's important to realize that the environment was having a major, major impact on the size and the shapes of the finch's beaks. And so we can see that from this one common ancestor, we have many, many, many different types of finches, different sizes, different coloration, different beak sizes as well. And so this is also going to help prove Darwin's theory of natural selection. I'm going to look at 3 specific types of finches. This first one, which is called Certhidia olivacea, they tend to be small, they have a slender beak, and they're there to eat insects. That should be eat, I apologize. The Geospiza difficilis tends to be larger. It has a fatter beak to anchor itself while it kicks eggs into rocks. Isn't that interesting? In order to eat the eggs, it's a larger animal, so it can kick the eggs into the rocks in order to eat it. And so this is this bird, this is this bird. And then the G. magnirostris, I hope I said that right, has a very large beak to crack hard seeds. So notice again depending upon whether it gets its food from insects or from eggs or from seeds, the beak size and shape also changes in order to help it to survive. All right. Darwin noted that each finch had a beak that fit its needs perfectly. And so scientists of Darwin's day would have said that God designed each one individually. And so I also think that that would be the case as well. And so Darwin, though, noticed that other than the unique beak, most of the other characteristics between the finches were the same. And so remember when Malthus was talking about populations and individuals fighting over limited resources, again, food is a very limited resource. And so the beak's shapes and sizes would change to help accommodate for those changes. And so Darwin proposed that each finch came from a shared common ancestor as the feeding need changed. However, I again want to point out, these are all still finches. They are not dinosaurs. They're not any other type of organism. They're always finches. And so even Darwin noticed that other than the beak, everything else between them is pretty much the same. And so if there were some changes that have resulted, it's not due to large sweeping changes. It's over these little changes over a large period of time. And so we'll get to talk about that in a couple days. All right. How could this happen? Let's use an example to help figure this out. If you remember our discussion on genetics, remember that a baby will inherit some of its traits from its father and some of its traits from its mother. And so think about yourself and remember that you share some traits with your dad and you share some traits with your mom. And so maybe the baby girl gets her mother's blue eyes, maybe the baby gets her father's brown hair. But what happens, for example, if the baby grows up to be 6.5 feet tall, but mom and dad are both 5'6" only? So why did this happen? Because remember, tallness is dominant over shortness, and so we would expect then that if both parents are short, then their daughter should be short. So why is it then that their daughter is very, very tall? Offspring, as we know from Mendel, tend to resemble their parents, but they oftentimes have characteristics that are quite different from their parents. And so you yourself probably have characteristics that neither of your parents share with you. And so, again, this got Darwin to thinking about why are these changes happening? Let's suppose long ago there was one finch. Let's say the food supplies were scarce. The finches have to compete for the limited resource of food, just as Malthus had predicted. The stronger of the finches would win the competition and therefore would pass along their strong genes to their offspring. And so if we had, for example, a finch that had a slightly shorter stout beak, it might venture off and start cracking seeds instead of eating insects because it's looking for another food source. It could win the competition over a finch with the original size beak, and then by reproducing, it would have offspring that would also have shorter, stouter beaks that would allow it then to eat or crack seeds so they could eat. Now, instead of just having the one finch, now we have two finches. We have the finch that has the original size beak, and now we have a new type of finch, but still a finch, that has a shorter, stout beak. And so now we're starting to see some divergence from the original ancestor. Let's look at another example. Say, for instance, there was a finch with a larger beak who might venture off and crack open eggs for food. It will win the competition over the finch that has a smaller beak. It will then be able to reproduce, which will then allow it to pass its larger beak on to its offspring. Now we have not just one finch, not just two finch, but now we have three finches. One that has the original beak, one that has a shorter stout beak, and one that has a large beak. And so we can see then depending upon the environment, how these will change over time. And so I'm going to go ahead and stop here for today. And so I hope you guys have a good rest of your day, and I will talk with you guys again soon.